Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm DeCandido, and welcome. This time around, I'm going to be reading an X-Men story, part of the Marvel series of novels and short story anthologies that I edited from 1994 to 2000, which were published by Byron Preiss Multimedia and Boulevard Books. Included a couple of X-Men anthologies. The first was called The Ultimate X-Men, which came out in 1996. And then in 2000, one of the last books we did in that particular run of Marvel novels was called X-Men Legends. It came out in 2000, the same year that the X-Men movie was released, actually, which proved to be good timing. And had a bunch of stories from throughout the X-Men's history by a bunch of different writers. And the one I did was called Diary of a False Man, which was about the forgotten X-Man known as the Changeling. For a little background, Professor Xavier was believed killed in X-Men number 42, and then in X-Men 65, it was revealed that Professor Xavier wasn't dead, that in fact he had been gone underground preparing for an alien invasion, and he had been replaced by a shapechanger known as the Changeling, who had been part of Factor 3, who was a bad guy that the X-Men had faced previously. And so this is sort of filling in the backstory on where the Changeling came from, which was never really revealed in the comics. So, without further ado, here is Diary of a False Man. Professor Xavier was dead. That, at least, was what Jean Grey had to pretend was the case. She couldn't imagine how things had gone so wrong. The man they had buried was not truly Charles Francis Xavier, Ph.D., world-renowned geneticist, headmaster of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, and, more secretly, powerful telepath and mentor to the team of teenage superheroes, the X-Men. Xavier was, in fact, presently in a sealed bunker beneath the school grounds, preparing for an invasion by an alien race known as the Xenox. Jean Grey was the only one of the X-Men who knew that he wasn't really dead, but she could not reveal the truth to anyone. After she and her four teammates, Scott Summers, Hank McCoy, Bobby Drake, and Warren Worthington III, had returned from the funeral to the mansion that housed the school, they played the message that Xavier had left for them in the event he was killed. Jean pretended to be surprised by it, even though she knew that the professor recorded such messages before any kind of mission. He was always prepared for the eventuality of his death. The man who took his place had felt obligated to do the same. To Jean's horror, she realized she didn't even know the man's real name. He had been called the Changeling, and he first encountered the X-Men as the second in command of the terrorist organization Factor 3. In the end, though, he had helped the X-Men defeat Factor 3's so-called mutant master. Then, in secret, he had taken the place of Professor Xavier. Just a few days ago, he died fighting Grotesque, a sacrifice that saved billions of lives. The recording of the Changeling as Xavier included a warning that Magneto might return soon, as indeed he had days earlier, facing the Avengers, and then came to an end with the words, "And now farewell, my X-Men. The torch has been passed, and I know you shall be worthy of it." The tears that ran down Jean's cheeks and dampened her yellow face mask were genuine, as she cried, "No, no, that can't be the end. It can't." And the words were not lies, though the other X-Men probably took a much different meaning from them. The careful plan that she, the Professor, and the Changeling had worked out had not taken the latter's death into account as a possibility. "It won't be, Jean," Hank said, tears also staining his mask, as the Professor himself recognized. "We must now carry on and make a new beginning." Hank McCoy was right. Of course, he usually was. She squeezed her teammate's oversized hand and smiled. Then she turned to the team leader, and also the man she loved, though she'd never dared to say so. "Scott, if it's okay, I'd like to be the one to go through the professor's things and pack them up." "Of course, Jean," Scott said stoically. "You knew him longer than any of us." She couldn't read his face. That was nigh impossible at the best of times, especially with the ruby quartz glasses that completely covered his eyes, but she didn't need to. She could feel his grief and pain. and she could feel that he was desperately trying to shut those feelings out, to carry on as leader of the X-Men, and not allow the grief to cripple him, especially with Magneto on the loose again. So having someone else do the onerous task of sorting through Xavier's effects would be fine with the X-Men's leader. Besides which, Scott spoke the truth. Unlike the boys, who were recruited to the X-Men out of high school, Jean first met Charles Xavier when she was 10 years old. Her best friend, Annie Richardson, had been run over by a car, and Jean had felt Annie die in her mind. The professor had brought her out of her ensuing depression telepathically, and also closed off her psionic abilities until she was ready to deal with them. That time had come just before Xavier had been replaced by the Changeling. Removing her mask, she went upstairs to the professor's study. His papers and computer files were very well organized. Anything personal she put in a separate pile to be placed in storage, perhaps in the attic. The school paperwork would also have to be dealt with, though Jean had no idea by whom. As she went through a pile of papers, files, and books, she realized that she probably needed to alert the school's lawyer, Michael Ramsey, about the situation. Or maybe, she thought, I can just not say anything. Then she chastised herself. Right, Jean, just hope Mr. Ramsey doesn't notice that his client is dead until he comes back from the dead in a few months. That'll work. Then there was the domestic staff. All the paperwork related to the running of the school that she didn't even pretend to understand. Who was going to deal with all that? Xavier's only family was a half-brother who despised him. Perhaps Mr. Ramsey could deal with it, but how could she explain the situation to him? Clenching her fist, she resisted an urge to pound on the desk. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The plan was that the Changeling would pretend to be Xavier for a few months, then Xavier would resurface from the bunker, they'd stop the Xenox, and the Changeling would go on with his life, having done something to help the world that he, as a member of Factor 3, had almost destroyed. When Jean, the professor, and the Changeling had discussed and planned this, it all seemed so sensible. And during those first weeks, it went very well. But then the shape-changer had to go and get himself killed. And Xavier was now in the bunker, completely unreachable, leaving Jean alone. The professor had made it clear that until he was ready, he could not leave the bunker. To emphasize the point, he'd coded the lock so that it could only be opened from the inside. Even if she wanted to, Jean could not reach Xavier until he chose to come out. So she had to maintain the charade and pretend that Charles Xavier was dead. Suddenly, she felt less like the mature woman, the valued teammate, the person in whom the professor had placed his trust, and a lot more like the frightened 18-year-old girl she really was. She didn't know what to do, and the one man who could help her couldn't be reached. At that moment, she hated the Changeling, hated him for putting her in this position, hated him for dying when she needed him to be alive. Maybe I should just tell the boys everything. They'll understand. Maybe we could break into the bunker and get the professor out. Bobby could freeze the lock, or maybe Scott could blast it down, or... Suddenly, she broke into tears. I can't handle this. She didn't care that the professor had been explicit in his instructions. She didn't care that he'd locked the bunker. She didn't care about how important it was that he be prepared for the Xenox's eventual arrival. She just wanted the professor back to make it all better. After a minute, she composed herself. She was almost done going through the pile. She would finish what she started, then go tell Scott and the others the truth. They deserved that. The world could go to hell for all she cared. She would not carry this burden alone. The last item in the pile was a book that Jean recognized as the professor's journal. She opened it to the back. Although she had no intention of reading it, she was curious as to when he'd last put in an entry. To her surprise, the last entry was dated only 5 days previous, the morning of the day the Changeling died. Flipping through the pages, she realized that he had maintained the journal. His skills as a forger, she realized, were as good as he had boasted weeks earlier. Skimming through it, Jean could not tell where the professor's handwriting ended and the Changeling's began. Closing the journal, she placed it in the box she labeled personal. Then she used her telekinesis to lift some of the administrative files into the air and tried to open one of the file cabinet drawers the same way. But the drawer wouldn't budge. At first, Jean thought it was because she was splitting her concentration between the drawer and the files, but she soon realized that the drawer was physically stuck. Placing the files back on the desk, she concentrated harder on the drawer. She mentally felt something physically blocking the tracks. Gently removing the object, she then took the drawer all the way out and moved the files into it. Then she pulled out the item itself. It was a small book. The cover had a lovely marble paper design, but no text. After replacing the drawer, she opened the book. The cream-colored pages had text written in very neat handwriting, with what seemed to be a simple ballpoint pen. Another journal of the professor's? She wondered, but no, the handwriting was different. She read the first page. I've had many names in my life. Charles Sage, Werner Ryman, Jack Bolton, John Askegren, Francisco Zarelli, Martina Johansson, and, most recently, Charles Xavier. But there's a difference with that last one. The guy who was born with it is still using it. He asked me to take his place, to become him when he went off to do something else. Part of being Charles Xavier is to keep a journal. Keeping his has made me decide to keep one of my own. I don't have long for this world. The doctor said the cancer would take me in 6 to 9 months. So I figured I should leave some kind of legacy. Especially since, if everything goes the way it's supposed to, only 2 people are going to know what I did in the end. Xavier himself and Jean Grey. Hell, only they and the X-Men and a few others are even going to know who I am. So I figure Xavier or Grey will someday read this journal, and then people will know just who this guy was. Jean felt her jaw fall open. He had cancer. He had only a few months to live. That explained why the Changeling had kept asking Xavier, "You won't be down for more than 6 months, right?" The professor had assured him that he wouldn't. It also explained something that hadn't made any sense to Jean at the time. As he lay dying in Warren's arms, the Changeling had said that he was dying of an illness that even I could not cure. At the time, Scott had thought that was why the professor had been pushing the X-Men so hard, because he needed to get the training in before he died. In fact, the Changeling was simply following Xavier's instructions to work the X-Men as hard as possible in preparation for the Xenox invasion. Instead, the Changeling let them believe that Xavier was dying in any case. Perhaps it was to take the sting out of his death at the hands of Grotesque, the knowledge that he would have died pretty soon anyhow. Or perhaps it was simply so someone would know that he was dying of cancer. Jean would never be sure. She had closed her mind off from the Changelings when he died. She only recently started using her telepathic powers. She didn't think she could handle feeling someone die in her head again. I shouldn't read this, she thought. It's his private diary. Besides, I have to go and tell the boys the truth. But he'd intended it to be found after he died. Just because that death happened several months ahead of schedule didn't change the intent. And suddenly she was consumed with a great desire to put off telling her teammates the truth. Not the day of the funeral, she rationalized. Give it a day or 2. She sat down in one of the leather guest chairs. The wheelchair-bound Xavier had never placed a chair behind the desk itself, of course, and turned to the second page. August 19th, 11:45 p.m. It's pretty late. Most of the X-Men have gone to bed, exhausted after the battle with the Frankenstein monster. And Xavier has locked himself in his bunker. For the last week or 2, Xavier and I have both been acting as the X-Men's mentor. He was the one who found out that the Frankenstein monster was real, which threw me for a loop, I don't mind saying. I was the one who told the X-Men about the mission initially, but he was the one who stopped the monster and wiped that boat crew's memory of the incident. This was his way of easing the transition, having each of us play the role of Xavier alternately. Seems to have worked, and now he's gone down in his bunker, leaving me with the X-Men. Since I didn't go on the mission to stop the Frankenstein android, I'm not as exhausted as the kids are, so I figured I'd start this journal for real. Begin at the beginning, the Queen of Hearts said in Alice in Wonderland, and that's probably where it makes the most sense. For me, the beginning was St. Julian's Orphanage for Boys in Central City, California, or as I like to call it, hell. My first memory is getting beaten up by Johnny Brill, one of the older boys. So are most of the other memories. I was a scrawny, sickly, ugly little kid. I didn't have a real name. The nuns had me listed as Charles Sage, but they made that name up. When I was older, I broke into St. Julian's records and found out that I'd been left at the orphanage as an infant, with a note saying, and I quote, "Tack care," spelled with a K, "of the boy. All I know about my parents is that they didn't want me, and they couldn't spell." But that came later, after puberty. Before that, I was just Johnny's designated victim. That changed one night when I was 14. I had a weird dream. Then I woke up. I went into the bathroom and some tall, muscular kid with a good-looking face stared back at me in the mirror. It took me a few minutes to realize it was me. It took me half a day to realize I could change myself back. But I didn't. To this day, I've never gone back to looking like what I looked like before. Why should I? The scrawny, ugly, sickly kid that the nuns called Charles Sage was a miserable little twerp whose main purpose in life was to be Johnny Brill's punching bag. I didn't need to be him anymore. The nuns didn't recognize me, assumed I was a trespasser, and threw me out. At first I thought everything would be great. Freedom, away from Johnny and the nuns. What I forgot is that St. Julian's, whatever its flaws, and believe me, it had plenty, also fed me 3 squares a day and put a roof over my head. I was in Southern California, so sleeping outside wasn't as much of a chore as it might have been, but I was still a 14-year-old kid with the clothes on my back and not a hell of a lot else. I noticed the beggars on the street. I started watching them and realized that the ones that looked crummy, but not really awful, were the ones who did the best. So I changed to look like one of those and panhandled for a few days. That at least got me enough to buy some lousy food. Then I went back to St. Julian's. I knew my way around the place. Years of hiding from bullies had taught me all the hidey holes, and I knew the security routine. So breaking in proved pretty easy. That was when I read my file. And then I went after Johnny. And I beat the holy crap out of him. It was the greatest moment of my life up to that point. Pathetic. All I'd lived for was to do to Johnny what he'd been doing to me for 10 years. But when I was done, I didn't know what else to do. I didn't even know who or what to be. All I'd known was the orphanage. Well, that and panhandling. So I went back onto the street and joined the ever-growing ranks of the homeless. Then Werner Ryman came along. Werner was a retired guy who apparently was bored, so he'd wander out and check out the homeless. He didn't want to give them money, he just wanted to lecture them on how they should make something out of their lives like he did. Worked at Consolidated for 47 years. Took a job right out of high school, retired at 65. Made me a nice little nest egg. Never heard me begging for no handout, no siree, Bob. For the better part of a week, I heard him use this spiel on various homeless guys. When he tried it on me, I told him to go away. It was easy for him to say, get a job. He had a name. He had an identity. All I had was a sickly kid named Charles Sage that I swore never to be again. That left me with nothing. Undaunted, Werner went to bother the colonel. He wasn't really the colonel, of course, but he did serve in the army. I got a look at his dog tags once when he was sleeping. He'd been a corporal. What war he served in changed depending on the time of day, and he had so much hair on his head and his face that you couldn't tell what age he was. Nobody messed with the colonel for 2 reasons. One was that he carried a pistol. The other was that he was as nutty as a fruitcake. But nobody told Werner Ryman either of these things. So old Werner was pretty surprised when the colonel shot him. Realizing what he'd done, the colonel ran off. So did the other local homeless guys. I didn't. What I was missing was a name and an identity. Werner Ryman had both, but he wasn't going to need them much longer. As the life bled out of Werner, I removed his clothes. I studied his face and his skin tone, looked for birthmarks, everything. Didn't take long, since I have a photographic memory, or at least I have since the day I discovered my powers. I'm not sure now if it's a part of my mutant abilities, or if I just don't want to remember the days before I stopped being Charles Sage. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. One look up and down Werner Ryman's body was enough for me to remember every detail of it. Then I became him. I now had his face, his ID, his wallet, his credit card, his car keys, and his nice little nest egg. I didn't have his fingerprints. I can't manage that, but that never turned out to be an issue. Werner Ryman was my ticket off the street. I'm getting tired. I'm gonna get some sleep. I'm surprised at how good it feels to get all this down. Been a while since I even thought about life in Central City. So much has happened since then. I'll probably do more tomorrow. August 20th, 7:30 p.m. Pretty routine day today. Ran the X-Men through a training session, then through a more traditional day in the classroom. Good thing Xavier prepared detailed lesson plans, since teaching is a bit out of my league. I had thought Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters was just a front, but this place really is a school, and these 5 kids are gifted. Especially McCoy. If he has any brains, and he's got plenty, he'll get out of the hero racket and become a scientist or something. He's got the talent. Anyhow, I just updated Xavier's journal, and I figured I'd do it for mine also. I left off at Werner Ryman yesterday. Werner's driver's license had his address, so I went there, changed into less bloody clothes, and then started to become Werner. The hardest part at first was duplicating his handwriting. After all, having his credit cards wouldn't do any good if I couldn't sign his name. Though the nuns always gave me bad penmanship marks, I was always good at copying things. Whenever they'd give us tracing paper and a drawing and told us to reproduce it on the paper, I never bothered putting the tracing paper on the picture. I just looked at it and copied it over and always did better than the other kids. The other kids, goaded by Johnny, usually used that as another excuse to beat me up, of course. So it didn't take long to hone my talent for forgery. I always wondered about that. Was the affinity for forgery a byproduct of the fact that I was a shape changer? Did my ability to copy things as a little kid have some kind of effect on what my mutant power would be? Or was it part of the telepathic talent I didn't even know I had until Xavier, Gray, and I concocted this plan? I wondered the same thing about being eidetic, for that matter. Yeah, I know, it's all philosophical and you can't answer it, but hell, it's my journal. If you can't be philosophical in your own journal, where can you be? Anyway, it took a couple of months, but I finally got Werner's handwriting down. Luckily, Werner was single, retired, and weird. He had a couple of relatives, but they didn't call that off, and I blew them off. They told me I was acting immature, which, in retrospect, was absolutely true. I mean, I was a 14-year-old passing myself off as 65. Werner was cranky. I was whiny. People noticed the difference. So now I had some money, a home, an identity. I was bored to tears. The problem was that Werner's nice little nest egg was fine for an old man, but it wasn't enough for a teenager who'd never had anything. One day, I came up with an idea on the spur of the moment. I'd gone to the corner deli to pick up a sandwich, and as I was paying, I heard the owner in the back telling one of the kids who worked there, "Remember, Marty, come back at 11 to take the till to the bank. That's 11, not a quarter after or half past. 11. I followed Marty for about 8 blocks after he left, making sure I knew his facial features and the clothes he was wearing. Then I went back to the store right at 11, having changed myself to be Marty. There was no sign of the genuine article. I figured from his conversation that he was always late. Sure enough, the owner made some noise about being stunned that I was on time for a change, gave me a canvas bag full of money, and I left. It wasn't much money, a couple hundred or so, but it was a start. By the time I hit my 18th birthday, I'd amassed a ton of cash. I was bored to tears. Again. You see, once I got the hang of it, using my powers to be a thief got boring. I mean, it was too easy. Also, honestly, I was really starting to hate being Werner Ryman. So I started doing other forging. God knows there was a market for it. And I never did 2 jobs with the same face, and I never used Werner's face for any of them. This was a good thing, as I didn't do such a great job covering my tracks in the beginning. There were probably about 12 APBs for guys fitting my description. Luckily, those guys would never be found. I also taught myself how to use computers. By the time I hit 19, I'd slowly created enough documentation, both physically and online, to establish another identity. This was a good-looking young guy of 30 named Jack Bolton. I slowly drained Werner's bank accounts and deposited all into one created for Jack, and moved all my stuff to an apartment in the upscale part of Central City. Then I pretended to be a neighbor of Werner's and called his cousin Myrtle saying nobody had seen Warner in days and he left the TV on really loud. Then I turned on the TV really loud, left Warner's apartment, and never came back. As Jack, I invested some money and I lucked out. A couple of investments turned out great and I was suddenly rolling in it. But I was still bored. I kept Jack around this time for whenever I felt like hobnobbing with the rich and stupid, but I went ahead and created a few more identities. Master Forger John Askegren, Mob Enforcer Francisco Zarelli, even a female pool hustler named Martina Johansson. I dropped Askegren when the heat was on after an insurance scam, but the other two worked just fine. Not that I needed the money, but breaking up the routine, one day foraging, one day hustling pool, one day beating up store owners, one day having lunch with my stockbroker, kept the boredom from setting in. Fire alarm just went off. Better go check it out. I'll do more tomorrow. Jean actually laughed at that. She remembered that night. Warren had been making one of his periodic and laughable attempts at cooking. The result, as usual, was inedibly burnt food, the fire alarm going off, and the X-Men assembling in the kitchen, ready to face some menace or other, and being confronted with a contrite Warren and ruined pots. And the Changeling had come down and given Warren a stern talking to that could just as easily have come from the professor himself. He was good at what he did, she thought. Maybe too good, she added, thinking of Johnny Brill and Werner Ryman. Not to mention Marty, that poor store clerk, who was probably blamed for the theft of the till. To her surprise, the next entry was dated 2 weeks later. September 3rd, 9:20 p.m. Haven't even thought about this journal in a while. Been busy putting the X-Men through their paces. I'm actually starting to like this. I'm used to running things, but it's nice to do it from a position of respect instead of power or fear. When I was running the day-to-day of Factor 3, the troops followed my orders because they were afraid of me and the Mutant Master. But the X-Men follow Xavier's orders because they respect him and care about him and believe in him. I didn't realize how hollow what I did for Factor 3 was until I became Xavier. And I have to say, I like this better. A lot better. Anyway, the details of my life in the last entry were starting to get dull, and you probably don't care about it. The interesting thing happened when I hit 30. As Zarelli, I got introduced to a new bagman, Johnny Brill. I almost didn't recognize him. It had been 15 years, and his nose hadn't been set properly after I broke it way back when. So it looked different. And of course his voice had changed. But he hadn't changed. He was still a bully. This really, really annoyed me. I'd gone to all the trouble of teaching him a lesson 15 years earlier, and he didn't even have the brains to learn it. At first, I decided to try teaching him the lesson again. I had lots of ways of doing it. I could frame him for a crime, I could ruin him financially, I could destroy his marriage. I could do all three. I had the power to do it. And that was the big thing. I realized that I had the power. So why was I wasting it on Johnny Brill? He was nothing. A stupid, low-life bagman for the Central City mob. This was worth getting worked up over? He was only human. That was the kicker. He was human. I wasn't. I was better. A lot happened after that. A big 4 showed up in the sky the same day that a Burning Man was sighted flying through the sky, and a rocky monster tore up the street. Soon after, we found out that that was the Fantastic Four, right before their first battle against the Mole Man. There was more. A big gray monster near a Southwest Air Force base. A man with long blonde hair claiming to be a Norse god. Guys in New York dressed like spiders and devils. And a man claiming to be the forerunner of a new race of humans taking over Cape Citadel, being stopped by a group of teenagers in matching black and yellow costumes. He called himself a mutant. Soon the news was full of people talking about mutants. I finally knew what I was. The question was, what to do about it. I can sense Gray walking toward the study. Better put this away. 11:35 p.m. Gray just had some administrative stuff to take care of, and we also set up a time to work on our telepathy tomorrow. She's been fantastic. We're both new to having telepathic powers. Xavier had repressed her psi abilities when she was a kid, and only took those blocks off recently. As for me, I had minor psionic talents all along. It helped make my shape-changing more convincing, allowed me to telepathically influence people into seeing what they expected. Xavier boosted that ability tenfold when I took over as him. but it's taken some getting used to. Gray and I have been kind of encouraging each other. Under other circumstances, I might try making a play for her. No, scratch that. She's way too young for me. I keep forgetting that she's only 18 years old. She carries herself better than most women I've known, but she really is still just a girl. Besides, it's patently obvious that she has the hots for Summers, only he's too into the brooding thing to realize it. It's getting late. I have an early session with the X-Men tomorrow. I've got to keep working them hard. We're all going to need to be in tip-top shape when the Xenox finally get here. Jean's head spun. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more. That the Changeling was attracted to her, if only a little, that he thought so highly of her, or that her feelings for Scott were so transparent to him. Every time she wanted to hate the man, she found that she couldn't bring herself to do so. But every time she wanted to like him, she learned of another despicable act he'd performed. September 6th, 8:15 p.m. I was going through some of Xavier's files today. Found a couple of newspaper clippings. One in particular caught my eye. An old New York Daily Globe front page item. Mutant menace! Dr. Bolivar Trask, noted scientist and researcher, warns of a mutant plot against U.S. I remember the first time I saw that headline. It was probably the second most important day of my life, after the day I woke up with a new face when I was 14. While I maintained apartments for Zerilli in the Heights and Johansson in the projects, I dumped the Askegren persona at this point, I spent most of my time at Jack Bolton's large house in the Central City suburbs. One night, I went home to find someone in my living room. First off, just that someone was in my living room was pretty spooky, since I had a state-of-the-art security system that hadn't been messed with at all. The intruder got past it without tripping it. He stood in the middle of the living room. He was wearing a large, black, billowing cloak with a hood that covered most of his face. And what the hood didn't cover was taken care of by a metal mask. I basically had no idea what he looked like. Who are you? Greetings, Mr. Bolton, he said in an electronically filtered voice. Or should I say Mr. Askegren? Perhaps Mr. Zerilli? Ms. Johansson? Mr. Ryman? Or shall I follow the lead of St. Julian's Orphanage and call you Mr. Sage? Such a multifaceted little changeling you are. Suddenly, I was very, very scared. More scared than I'd been since any time after I'd left the orphanage. In fact, it was the first time I'd been scared since then. There was no way anyone could connect me to all those names. One or two, maybe, but not all of them. Who the hell are you? My real name is unimportant. You see, my dear changeling, while you are a mutant, I am the master of mutants. And I have a proposition for you. I didn't know what this guy could do, but I figured I was more than I could if he could break in here so easily, so I said, I'm listening. A gloved hand emerged from the folds of his cloak. It held a newspaper. Have you seen this? He asked. It was the same Globe headline about Trask. No, I said. I didn't take that long to get the gist of it. Trask, an anthropologist, was claiming that mutants had a secret agenda to take over the United States and would enslave normal humans in labor camps. Sensationalist hogwash, I said, tossing the paper aside. What does it have to do with me? Oh, Trask is doing more than what you see there. The public doesn't know of it yet, but he has been developing sentinels, giant robots that will seek out mutants and stop them. Another type of fear gripped me. Stop them how? And how do you know this? The same way I know who you are, Changeling. I am the Mutant Master, and Trask's sentinels will fail. How do you know that? Because Trask is an anthropologist, not a roboticist. His sentinels are flawed. They were ineptly conceived and incompetently constructed. I have every faith that they will fail in their intended task. Then why show me this article? I asked. I was completely confused by this entire conversation, and I was still waiting for the proposition that the Mutant Master had promised. Because Trask raises an excellent point. Mutants are the next step in evolution, and by rights we should take over the world. My proposition, little changeling, is to form the very conspiracy that Trask imagines. I have already begun to construct this organization, which I have christened Factor 3. But I need a second in command, one who can handle the day-to-day operations, someone who can combine his shape-changing abilities with the resources at my disposal to seek out and recruit allies and gather information on enemies. You are ideally suited to the task. I thought about Johnny Brill. I thought about how easily I had manipulated humans to gain money and power. And yet, what kind of power was it, really? I was 3 different false people. The Mutant Master was giving me an opportunity to be someone. That someone would be the Changeling. I not only accepted the Mutant Master's proposition, I also offered to provide funding for Factor 3. He declined that, saying it wasn't an issue, and then said, "I'll be in touch." And then he just disappeared, which, if nothing else, explained how he got past my security system. Over the next few months, we put Factor 3 together. I sought out and recruited a variety of mutants. These were grown men who called themselves the Vanisher, Eunice the Untouchable, the Blob, and Mastermind. I have to admit, I've never understood the need for such colorful names. I mean, yes, I call myself the Changeling, but that's due to a lack of alternatives. But when you've got a perfectly good name like Fred J. Dukes, why on earth would you prefer to be named after a stupid movie monster? Not all our recruits came willingly, of course. While Dukes and the other 3 seemed eager to further our cause, Sean Cassidy, a former Interpol agent, was more reluctant. But I was able to put him under our control using the amazing technology that the Mutant Master had at his disposal. With all the gadgetry he had, it was no wonder he turned down my offer of funding. The long-term plan was to start a 3rd World War by convincing each superpower that the other side had launched a strike. When the 2 powers wiped each other out, the 3rd factor, us, would take over. Mutants would finally rule. It started to unravel when we kidnapped Xavier, and I began doing surveillance on the X-Men. For one thing, the Mutant Master was getting more and more unstable. He started firing laser blasts at me to keep me in line, and gave ever more eccentric orders. But more to the point, I saw something in the X-Men. They were fighting to save humanity. And Dukes and the other mutants we had gathered were all just in it for themselves. They didn't care about the destiny of the human race. They were just thugs who wanted revenge on the X-Men for past indignities. Finally, I realized what was happening. The war we were trying to start wouldn't just wipe out most humans. It would wipe out everything. I checked the Mutant Master's computer, and it confirmed what I was starting to suspect. My boss was trying to kill everyone, mutants and humans alike. And that's when I realized why he had access to such amazing technology. The Mutant Master was an alien trying to destroy the Earth. The X-Men had managed to stop the missiles from being fired, and had returned to Factor 3's base to stop us. Dukes and the others prepared to defend the base. Disguising myself as Xavier, I convinced the X-Men to stop fighting their fellow mutants, but rather focus their attention on Factor 3 itself. I also sowed enough doubt in Factor 3's enforcers about their boss's true motives to make the Mutant Master panic and attack everyone. That did my work for me. Between the X-Men and Factor 3 enforcers, the Mutant Master was defeated, his alien nature revealed. In the end, the alien committed suicide when he realized he had failed. The X-Men let everyone go, including me. After all, they're not like the Avengers. They had no authority to arrest us, no facility to imprison us. At first, I returned to Jack Bolton's house in Central City. But I couldn't go back to that life. Seeing the X-Men in action, seeing these kids risking everything to make the world a better place, opened my eyes even more than realizing I was above petty revenge against Johnny Brill. I needed to do something worthwhile for the world I'd almost destroyed. Then the pain started. A trip to the emergency room confirmed that I had cancer. Best guess was I got it shortly after I started working for Factor 3. It had gone too far to be operable, and chemotherapy wound up doing no good whatsoever. The joys of being a mutant, probably. Our kind tend to have an increased resistance to radiation. So I went to the one person who would understand a mutant wanting to leave the world a better place than it was when he came in. Xavier. I didn't expect him to ask me to take over as him, but it was something I figured I could handle. I even got to learn something about myself, that I was a telepath too. In some ways, I was glad I didn't find that out until after Factor 3. If I was even close to being on a par with Xavier then, things might have turned out a lot differently. I just read over what I wrote. Wow. I can see why people do this now. It feels kind of good to get it all down on paper like this. Kind of liberating, you know? I'm not sure what anyone's supposed to get out of my life story. I mean, let's face it. If you're a shape changer, don't hire on as the second in command of a terrorist organization led by an alien out to destroy the planet isn't exactly universally applicable advice. Still, maybe it'll do somebody some good sometime. Maybe that somebody will be me. September 7th, 6 a.m. I had a strange dream last night. A woman was asking me my name, and I couldn't tell her what it was. And what would I tell someone who asked me that now? Charles Sage is a name some nuns made up. Jack Bolton, John Askegren, Francisco Zarelli, and Martina Johansson were names I made up. Werner Ryman and Charles Xavier are really other people. Even the Changeling is a nickname an alien had for me that I took as a cutesy moniker. What will they put on my headstone when I die? I have no idea. I don't even have a proper will. Whose will would it be? Jack Bolton's? He's not real. Any competent lawyer would tear it to ribbons. What kind of legacy am I going to leave? Dear God in heaven, I'm dying, and no one will know who I was. 10:20 a.m. What maudlin garbage I wrote before. Oh well. I let McCoy and Drake head into the city for dates with their girlfriends. Meanwhile, Worthington, Summers, and Gray have a session this afternoon. Jean shuddered. That was the day that Hank and Bobby first encountered Grotesque in the subway. What happened that day would lead to the Changeling's death. She wasn't sure she wanted to keep reading. But I've come this far. I just read over what I wrote this morning, and I started thinking about the X-Men. Most of the world doesn't appreciate what they've done. The news is always talking about the Avengers and the Fantastic Four, but never about the X-Men. Or if they do, it's to follow Trask's route and declare them a menace out to destroy humanity. They've saved the world more than once, including from my own organization. Nobody knows. Nobody appreciates them. And yet they keep doing it anyhow. If they all died tomorrow fighting Magneto or Mastermind, it probably wouldn't even make the inner pages of the newspapers. They know this, but it doesn't stop them. They keep laying it on the line. Even if it is a lie, I'm supposed to be their mentor. I can do no less. Maybe they won't know who I am when I die, but I'll know. I'm the Changeling, and I help save the world. Nobody can take that from me. 11:30 p.m. Not been a good day. I didn't deal with the X-Men very well at all. I think that dream had me more flamboozled than I thought. Or maybe it's this journal. My emotions have been all churned up, and it's not allowing me to focus. From what I've been able to read in McCoy's and Drake's thoughts, they fought a nasty mutant who called himself Grotesque. To make matters worse, Xavier's mutant-hunting computer, Cerebro, has detected Magneto. We may have to deal with him. I need to go get a full report from the X-Men. September 8th, 1:05 a.m. The situation with Grotesque is worse than I thought. He's too much for these kids to handle. They've got the heart for it, but I don't think they have the skill. Not that I'm sure I do either. But Grotesque is going to destroy the entire planet. I can't let him do that. I almost destroyed this world once. I'm sure as hell not going to let it die now. I have a plan that should work, but it's risky. I'm recording another one of Xavier's play this if I die messages just in case. He's apparently recorded one of these every time the X-Men are involved in something dangerous. This is the first time I've had to do one. And I better tell them about Magneto too, again, just in case. And I still can't get that question out of my head. What will they put on my headstone when I die? That was the final entry. Of course, what they put on his headstone was somebody else's name, she thought sadly. She felt Bobby Drake approach the room, and she quickly put the Changeling's journal under the desk. Do I tell them? She asked herself. Then she thought about what the Changeling wrote in his journal, about sacrificing his life, even if nobody knows. He faced his death with his eyes open. And so do we, every day. Because we believe in what the professor taught us. I have to believe in him now. Jeannie? The youngest X-Man said as he poked his head into the study. Scott's used Cerebro to track Magneto down, and he's come up with another one of his cunning plans to stop him. He wants us downstairs. Of course, Bobby. You okay, Jean? Wiping the tears from her eyes, Jean said, I'll be fine, Bobby. I'll be fine. That story was in X-Men Legends, which came out in 2000. Like most of the Marvel books, it's out of print right now. Audiobooks of a lot of Marvel Prose projects have been released recently. That is not one of them yet, but hopefully sometime soon that will happen. Thank you for listening to KRAD COVID Readings. Please subscribe to the channel. Please check me out online at DeCandido.net. Please read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. Please read my nonfiction on Tor.com. Please order my books from whatever your online book dealer of choice is, Amazon, BN.com, Kobo, whatever, Powell's. Please support my Patreon at patreon.com/crad. And please stay safe.